The ferry Norman Atlantic left the Greek port of Patras before dawn on December 28, 2014, bound for Ancona, Italy, with winter weather rolling across the Adriatic. On the vehicle decks below, trucks and cars sat packed bumper to bumper, some with refrigerators humming or power cables draped. Up above, families found bunks, drivers claimed seats in lounges, and students stretched out under coats, ready to sleep through a rough but ordinary crossing. Nothing about the night felt extraordinary, until a thin smell of hot rubber slid under a few cabin doors and into the stairwells. Within minutes, it was smoke. At around 5:30 a.m., alarms sounded. Somewhere among the tightly parked lorries, a fire had kindled and then found everything it needed: diesel mist, plastic tarp, tires, pallets, cardboard. Heat climbed fast. Smoke poured through ventilation trunks, turning corridors amber and then black. Passengers woke coughing, groping for shoes and passports, knocking on neighbors' doors, calling children's names into a darkness that tasted like burnt oil. Public address announcements crackled between languages, the words fragmenting as the system struggled. Some were told to wait in cabins, others to muster inside, others to move up to the open decks for air. The ship had already become a maze. The Norman Atlantic carried sprinklers and drencher systems designed to knock down vehicle deck fires. But the flames moved across the canyon of trucks faster than valves could open and pumps could pressurize. Hatches meant to compartmentalize the garage jammed or were left open by people trying to flee. Crews hauled hoses through heat that baked paint into blisters. On the upper decks, doors heaved against wind and panicked hands. Passengers stumbled outside into cold rain and a gale that shoved spray sideways and set the ferry rolling. Lifeboats hung in their cradles like promises no one quite believed. Lowering boats in that sea was a gamble. Lines snapped. A davit boomed once, twice, then frozen hardware refused to pivot. A few boats that bit water were grabbed by the swell and slammed back against the hull. People who tried rope ladders were flung into black water and vanished between crests. The captain, reading the weather, kept the majority high on the open decks rather than launching into a killing sea. It was a grim choice. Smoke and exposure above, flame and asphyxiation below. Families wrapped scarves over children's faces, soaked handkerchiefs at deck drains, and blinked through stinging air. Maydays went out. Italian and Greek coast guards punched through the gale to stand off at cautious distances, bows rising and falling. Helicopters beat toward the ship, testing cross winds, flying sideways to hold a hover. A winchman dropped onto the tilting deck, clipped a harness after a freighted heartbeat with a stranger, then rose, swinging. Each sortie lifted only one or two. Each return trip was a lifetime for those still staring up at the storm's gray ceiling and counting rotations like beads. Medics on receiving ships laid out blankets and oxygen, cut away burned clothing, and pressed warm packs into shaking hands. The fire did not explode. It endured. Fuel fed it in layers. Tires within trucks within a garage inside a ferry inside a storm. Water hissed on hot steel and ran away when it could not reach the source. On the exposed decks, people formed small communes of necessity. Drivers shared gloves and knit caps. A tourist with asthma passed her inhaler to an elderly man. A trucker tied a scarf over a child's mouth whenever the helicopter wash cut through. A young couple counted breaths aloud, inventing a cadence against panic. Hours stretched. Dusk insisted itself on a day that had barely begun, and still the fire ate and the sea shook. Reports on shore struggled to keep up with reality. News bulletins flashed uncertain numbers, this many rescued, that many missing, revised again as manifests met the truth that not everyone aboard had been counted. In the holds, crew members suspected unregistered migrants trapped behind doors, people whose absence would be tallied only by friends waiting beside silent phones. The Norman Atlantic turned from a ship into an argument conducted in wind and smoke. How much risk to take with lifeboats? How long could helicopters fly? Through the long night, the rescue choreography continued. Approach, hover, winch, lift, bank away. Pilots flew until fuel and weather forced them to brake. Winch operators rubbed cramping forearms and went again. Coast Guard crews rigged high lines and floodlit the deck. At some point, the rain turned to needles. At another, the sea built a taller wall, and then, mercifully, began to tire. By the following evening, hundreds had been lifted away, each small victory paid for in fuel, muscle, and nerve. Not all escaped. By the time the last pockets were cleared, dozens were dead, some overcome by smoke, some fallen or flung, some lost in the first, worst hours below decks where the fire started. The final accounting would remain imperfect. Families flew to ports and hospitals, reading lists taped to walls and asking the same questions in 2 languages until answers arrived or did not. Funerals in Greece, Italy, and beyond braided grief with anger. How, they asked, could a modern ferry become a furnace in the middle of a sea patrolled by 2 nations? Investigators began the slow, disciplined work of naming causes so they could be removed from the future. They photographed scorched steel, traced heat patterns, pulled data from recorders, and took testimony from passengers whose memories mixed ash and wind with seconds that would not stop replaying. They modeled airflow through ventilation shafts and timed closures of fire doors that had stuck. They checked maintenance logs for drencher valves and pump tests. They noted that lifeboat gear had been asked to work at the edge of its design envelope. They wrote that training was inconsistent, announcements confused, and muster plans unequal to a deck that had become a chimney. Regulators pushed recommendations into law: better monitoring of vehicle deck temperatures, strict control of powered cargo, drills that reflected weather and darkness, clearer multilingual alarm protocols, refits to ventilation so smoke would be throttled rather than channeled. Operators promised compliance, insurers required it. Some changes arrived quietly: sturdier door gear, checklists that asked harder questions and would not allow easy answers. Every adjustment was a memorial in miniature for someone who had not come home. When the hull was finally cool enough to move, tugs took the Norman Atlantic under tow, a charred geometry against winter water. Up close, the ship looked like a negative image of itself. White turned to charcoal, windows crazed, decks collapsed. The photographs outlived the news cycle. They appear when other ferries catch fire, a reminder that the elements are pre-modern even when the equipment is not. The sea will magnify whatever you bring aboard: negligence or rigor, complacency or care. What remains is a ledger with 2 columns. In one are the failures that set the stage: crowded cargo, casual rules, tired drills, machinery maintained to the minimum, a belief that tomorrow would be like yesterday. In the other are the people who refused to look away when the stage caught fire: pilots and winchmen, deckhands tying knots with frozen fingers, passengers who held a stranger's hand and shared the last dry scarf. Between those columns, a storm wrote a verdict in heat and wind. More than 400 lived because rescue was stubborn. Dozens died because risk had been stacked too high for too long. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.